I'm excited for this nenext panel, and I hope you'll be excited as well. We've got a great group here. By the way, I'm Jeremy Grant, Managing Director with the Chertoff Group. I joined all of 4 months ago, and am pleased to be part of such a great organization. Pleased that all of you could come out today for this Security Series event. So this panel discussion is titled, Enough with Getting Owned Through Passwords, It's Time for Stronger Identity Solutions. There's been two constants in cybersecurity the last couple of years. The first has been a steady drumbeat of major breaches, with every month seeming to bring news of yet another incredibly damaging attack. I think most of us are pretty familiar with this. The second constant is one that's gotten a lot less attention than the first, and I think it's a bit surprising when you tell people, which is that almost every one of these major breaches, Target, Home Depot, JP Morgan Chase, Sony Pictures, Anthem, the OPM breaches we were just discussing before lunch, have all been executed through the same vector of attack, exploiting the weaknesses of the common password. And there's a reason for this. In an era when a lot of organizations have built sophisticated systems for defending their networks, the password is the glass door on the fortress. Rather than break through the fortress wall, it's been easier to get in by simply stealing the identity credentials of someone who has had access to systems and data, which, given how many users most of these organizations have had, means there's a pretty broad attack surface for the bad guys to pursue. The famous bank robber Willie Sutton, when he was asked, "Why do you rob banks?" replied, "That's where the money is." Why are hackers going after passwords? Because that's where the access to your systems are. Just as water will seek its lowest point, attackers seek the easiest way into a system, and these days, that entry point is identity. There was an alert from Dell SecureWorks last month that revealed that nearly every intrusion they'd responded to in the last year, hackers actually weren't bothering with malware. Instead, cybercriminals, this is their quote, utilized the target's own system credentials and legitimate software administration tools to move freely throughout this company's network, infecting and collecting valuable data. So the good news is there's a variety of technologies and solutions that are emerging to combat these threats. Some of them deal with replacing or augmenting passwords. Others focus on more secure management and governance of identity solutions themselves. So we're going to explore those today, discussing how better identity solutions can help stem this tide of breaches, as well as how they can provide more streamlined, user-friendly security experiences for logging into systems and sites, getting people quick access to the resources they need without creating new hassles. So let me quickly introduce our panel today. Their bios are all in the program. In the middle is Paul Grassi, who's the Senior Identity Standards and Technology Advisor at the National Institute for Standards and Technology. Darren Rolls, immediately next to me, is the CTO of SailPoint, a stellar firm that has products that help organizations properly manage and govern identities and credentials. And Brett McDowell on the end is the Executive Director of the FIDO Alliance, an organization devoted to creating new standards and technologies, or new standards and specifications that enable quick adoption of more secure authentication technologies. So before we start throwing out questions, I just wanted to ask a couple questions of the audience. Put your hand up if you have to manage more than 10 passwords between your work and personal accounts. Keep your hand up if that number's 20. 25? All right, now those who still have your hands up, please keep them up, don't put them down. Keep your hands up if each of you actually have a separate, unique password for each of the 25 plus passwords that you have.
I'm a hacker, by the way.
And are you following guidance on each of them for 12 plus characters with uppercase, lowercase symbols and numbers as the NIST suggests?
Yes.
All right, so one. She works in our office, maybe she's been listening. But for the rest of you, this actually isn't shocking. We have policies on passwords that, at least in this room, we've established only one person follows. Now, is this a sign that we need to be more diligent on these security policies, or it is a sign that the guidance we're giving people is so impractical that nobody's going to bother to follow it? Who wants to start?
Interesting question.
None of the above. So I think the problem is inherent. So passwords are, in InfoSec speak, a shared symmetric secret, meaning that the user has to know something, they have to know the secret, and the server side has to know the same secret. And in order to exchange that, especially passwords or one-time passcodes, you're going to type that into some interface. That opens up so many vulnerabilities. Social engineering, tricking the user to put that secret in the wrong box, man-in-the-middle attacks, and then they're just sitting there waiting to be harvested on the server later in some breach event. So I don't think we want to invest a lot of time polishing the turd that is passwords. And I think instead we need to evolve to an entirely different authentication credential scheme.
I completely agree. As one of the few, or the many in NIST working on authentication guidance, I actually consider the password a vulnerability. We want to make recommendations that actually eradicate the password as much as possible, or at least relegate it to where it belongs, which is to protect worthless, not very meaningful data, just as a simple way to gain access to something you've been to before, and then push the rest of the services that are online to two-factor.
That makes very good sense. As you can hear, I can barely have a voice left, so this is interesting. Hopefully you can still hear me. Somebody said that scotch and tea would help. I'm not sure.
It'll certainly make this panel more interesting for
That's
you.
right. It's going to make a more interesting conversation, if nothing else. But I don't believe I'm contagious, but barely have a voice. I think I agree with a couple of things they've said there, but I think there's an underlying difference that I feel. And that is I agree completely that a password is a vulnerability. It is the point of attack for many of the vulnerabilities, many of the attacks that we see today. But if we could wave a magic wand and remove every password in every system and do it tomorrow, I'd wave that wand. In fact, if I owned that wand, I'd probably own the big white house just over the road here somewhere, right? Because it's something that's very, very, very hard problem. And so I think what we have to focus on as well is the ability to accurately manage and enforce our password policies and our password strategies for the systems that are in place today and that fundamentally aren't going away as soon as we would like. So I think it's I hate the word, I'm not going to repeat the word beginning with T, just in case I don't want to be quoted with that. But I don't think we have to polish it. I think we just have to manage it appropriately. And with the right technology, we can do that today as we move towards a reduction in passwords.
The analogy's running through my head on that. How to manage that turd is...
Let's not go there.
So one of the things, full disclosure, until a few months ago, I was working at NIST, which focuses on measurement science and standard reference materials. And while they don't have turd, they do have standard reference dried urine that you can actually buy. It's a fascinating agency. So focusing on this and its devotion to measurement science, Paul, you mentioned you see passwords as a vulnerability. NIST can measure something like the kilogram. In fact, they're in charge in the US of helping to perfect globally what the definition of a kilogram is. When you look to cyber, a lot of what you're looking at is how long can something actually hold up under an attack from, say, a reasonably resourced adversary. So with what is the relative strength of a 12 or 16 character password these days?
Well, in my least NIST way, I'd say garbage. We're really struggling, and one of the reasons why I like coming out to talk to folks like you guys is to test ideas that we're thinking about in future guidance. On one hand, 863, which is the EAuth guidance that governs how agencies implement identity and authentication, it's been around for 10 years and it's held up. That's pretty impressive in the cyberspace. And it spends a lot of time talking about password entropy, which is that measurement. And we're seriously debating throwing that requirement out. And there's a few reasons why. One is which, if we get our way and push passwords to the bottom of the barrel for low-risk solutions, then it doesn't really matter what the entropy is because the risk of the system you're protecting doesn't really matter. The second reason is, even though it's held up for 10 years, entropy requirements now only hold up for 10 minutes. And the second, or the day we think it's 10 minutes, somebody has a new algorithm to break it in 10 seconds. So I don't know if we'll get away with this, but do we put passwords in something like the National Vulnerability Database and put the mitigations that are relevant to that password there? And then have, in the spirit of continuous diagnostics and mitigation and monitoring and dashboarding, do we use SCAP, which is the standard to look at configurations, report out how good agencies are doing with passwords, rather than putting that guidance in a document that, once it's codified and signed, will take 2 years to dust off and update.
Interesting. So Brett, let's talk a little bit about the alternatives to, I'm going to give this one up after I use the word here one last time, but the polishing the turd. You lead an organization called the FIDO Alliance that's focused on something very different. Tell us about it.
Sure. So this is a global It started off as an industry coalition. It's now a public-private coalition, the Fast Identity Online Alliance, or FIDO for short. And we have about 250 organizations in the alliance now, including government agencies from the US, UK, Germany, and China. And what we're trying to do is create new global standards, technical standards, that would essentially create a new protocol between devices and online services. So that means authenticating over the web through a web browser, as well as native apps or any other client-side software connecting to a server. So it's the online authentication piece. And what we've been standardizing is an asymmetric cryptography protocol. So we had to get away from what was fundamentally so vulnerable about passwords, which is this shared secret and something you know, to a system that is essentially something you have and can be made stronger by something you are. So a combination of having possession of a device that has a private key protected in hardware, protected against malware attacks in a secure element or trusted execution environment, doing the authentication for you online, and also then the server only has this public key that was generated at registration time. That means if the server is breached, there are no secrets that have been given up. No credentials been lost. So you get away from that whole disastrous cycle that we're on with passwords. And then on the local device, you can enhance the security and usability by using something like biometrics to do user verification locally, keeping that user's biometric information protected in that same trusted execution environment on the device. And so not sitting out there like in OPM's case to get breached and stolen. And so what you end up with, and what we have defined and is deployed now on hundreds of millions of devices and several major brands, is a totally new approach to authentication that ends up being easier to use because you just touch something, look at something to authenticate. You don't have to type anything in. And it's much more secure because it simply doesn't have the vulnerabilities associated with phishing or rich execution environment malware.
Thanks.
So that's what FIDO is. And
Who's supporting it?
Yeah, I would say.
Who's driving this?
So I think the first deployment was PayPal and Samsung for mobile payments. So the fingerprint scanner on the Samsung Galaxy S5 phones over a year ago. You could link that to your PayPal account using FIDO standards and do all of your mobile payments that way with just a fingerprint scan. Then Alipay adopted it in China. They're like PayPal but much larger in China. Then Google rolled out our second factor authentication, something they call security key, but it's FIDO Universal Second Factor Standards compliant. You can add that to your Google account now. Then Google later added it to Google for Work, so all the businesses can use it now in enterprise. And NTT Docomo deployed this. They have both iris recognition and fingerprint recognition on FIDO certified phones in Japan. I wonder who else I'm missing. Bank of America most recently deployed it on their mobile banking app. So the first time Bank of America took a fingerprint for authentication on mobile banking, they did it using FIDO to make it more secure than just the password management APIs that are available on some of those devices.
And we're members as well. And while it's not, FIDO tokens aren't in use in the federal government yet, there are multiple use cases that we're exploring to bring that technology to bear in U.S. government. There's citizen to government use cases. There's a derived PIV credential. For those of you that don't know, it's right now scoped to, deriving a token from this thing to have on a mobile device. So there's use cases there with some policy and technical things we need to overcome. And then there's a significant population of federal employees and contractors that aren't getting PIVs for good reasons and some not so good reasons. And what are we giving them instead? We're giving them usernames and passwords. So why not give them something strong, easy to use, interoperable?
I guess I may have one more comment on that, if it'll come out. To say quite clearly, I'm fully in support of strong authentication and normalizing that authentication layer. Very, very important. However, authentication is only so interesting. The real challenge is authorization. It's, it's giving people access to the right things. And I think to Jeremy's original thought that if you look below most breaches, there are passwords at fault somewhere in the line. Ultimately, that just gives access to an account that is not understood, that is not cataloged, that is not managed. Nobody understands the risks. I think Mark Weatherford said something earlier that I think we should all take away very significantly. Understanding the risk and the inventory is the most important thing we can do. So my only concern for a push that we now see and some of the things that Paul was saying around a change in NIST towards passwords, towards strong authentication, is that we're going to over-obsess with authentication and that we're going to see it as the silver bullet that's going to fix all of our problems, just like having a strong perimeter was going to save us from the bad guys. That passwords are evil in the wrong hands, but they can be used securely. And I think if we were to use some of our resource and some of our attention to just overlay appropriate management capabilities, train our people what entropy means. I mean, who understands what password entropy is here? Truly. I mean, do you understand what password entropy is? Everybody should understand this. My mother understands it. I've taught her what it means. So, don't use words that people recognize. I can, in a millisecond, scan every word you've ever heard and compare it with every number that ever existed and check it against the password. Use crazy words, use phrases, use strategies to come up with complex passwords that are then appropriately stored cryptographically. That is very secure. A 12-character high-entropy password stored with scrypt, nobody can decrypt that today. LastPass, I don't know if anyone's here a LastPass user. LastPass is a password replay product. They had a breach. They weren't sure if somebody had walked off with their password database. They basically advised their users that they trained people what entropy meant and said, if you have entropy, you're perfectly safe. This is S-crypted, bcrypt and S-crypted. The bad guys do. There is not enough compute on the planet to take a high entropy 14-character high entropy password that is S-crypted. It doesn't exist. So whereas I think is highly admirable and we 100% support it. We do single sign-on. We supply some of this technology. When our customers ask for it, we will support FIDO. But I think by the same token, we have to look behind that authentication and look at the broader system of what's available in the classic enterprise today.
Selfish kind of shout out or recommendation, A130 is out for public comment on GitHub. And
this, for those who aren't familiar with government, since we've got a mix of people in the room, is government's policy on managing IT resources.
I know our office, when Jeremy was there as well, pushed very hardly for, bookending identity management, looking at language around strong auth and looking at language around management of identities, not only just when they show up, but as they change jobs and as they leave. That's out for draft. I mean, that's where you can get the language that we need that, drove this GRC movement in private sector, like SOX. So, I think if the federal government's not doing a good job there, and that's the observations of the group in the room, then let's comment on A130 to get some of that in there.
So let me pivot the conversation a little bit. Brett and I were having birds of a feather discussion at lunch where we talked about FIDO as the future. I think actually everybody's in agreement. This is going to take some time before any new technology for authentication is ubiquitous. And sort of going through the cycle of what it's going to actually take when you get to a point where, as FIDO dreams of, there aren't passwords anymore. In the meantime, I know you had a separate discussion over here about the focus on an identity-centric approach to cybersecurity. So what does that mean? Borrowing a line from Paul, I've known Paul for a long time. He's always said authentication's great, but authentication by itself gets you
nothing.
So, when you're looking at enterprise systems and looking for really ways to govern the broader use of identity in a cybersecurity system, what are the things that people need to be thinking of?
Who wants to take that?
This is for you, Darren.
Okay, for me, unfortunately.
Well, to start with.
So SailPoint is in the identity governance and administration space, sometimes called just purely identity governance. I guess for this forum, we should probably really say it's about entitlement governance, which is really the idea that we're able to catalog and understand access, authorization, basically, if we talk technically about it. But it's fundamentally to take an understanding of the relationships between a real person and the accounts that they are given to carry out a particular role. And within those accounts, what that physically gives access to. So being able to point to an Active Directory group and understand the physical data that it gives access to. That's the fundamental principle of identity governance, understanding those relationships. And a password is one of those data attributes for us, basically. So managing it appropriately falls into that same bucket for us. So I think that's the moniker of governance, and I think it includes, of course, any form of strong authentication, managing those repositories as well. So.
There are 3 efforts that we're kicking off that I think will do a lot in support of both what Fido and folks like Brett are doing, and as well as the SailPoints of the world. And then there's kind of 2 adjacent that I'll talk about if I have time. But the first is on the authenticator side. How do we know what the strength of the authenticator is? We don't have a lot of measurement science around that. And as a NIST guy and as someone that now sits in a new division called the Applied Cybersecurity Division, we're really looking at adding measurement science to areas that did not exist before. So we have some fuzzy metrics or some fuzzy feelings about what's strong in identity and strong in authentication. Is a SMS to your phone as strong as a FIDO U2F token that's using asymmetric cryptography? I would argue, no, they're not as strong, but they're bucketed in the same category. So we're looking at metrics to be able to measure and test and assert strength of authenticators. And now as you walk down the stack towards what Darren does, we're also looking at strength of identity proofing. If you don't have a really good, strong identity that's bound to the human that's using that strong token, then you still have nothing. You're giving access to the wrong person. So we're looking at how we can actually say that this remote proofing process or this in-person proofing process or this security check is got a certain strength. And then once we have that, all the attributes that surround a user, that come with them through the proofing process, that come with them through some professional certification, that come to them through self-assertion, we need to be able to measure the confidence in that to be able to make access control decisions in a much more effective way than just saying, yeah, I trust this entity to give me data, but I really don't know if the data is that true. So those are the 3 things we're kicking off in this new division. We're having a workshop in January. These guys will be there, hopefully. Other folks will be there, but it's again to get rid of the fuzziness and actually put metrics on identity.
100%. Right. So even though I'm here to talk about kind of the future of authentication, let me put some things in the context. So the job I had before I was running the FIDO Alliance is I was running ecosystem security at PayPal. And before that, I was running customer security initiatives, which meant that I was responsible for all the customer-facing security products and capabilities of the organization. I had operational InfoSec responsibility, which, by the way, the whole conversation about risk management, our whole security group was called the Information Risk Management Group. We deliberately did not call our group InfoSec. So the reason I bring that up is when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about vulnerabilities and exploitations. That's it. It's very simple. There are vulnerabilities and then there's exploitations, and everything you do to try to remove or mitigate the risk of exploitation of your vulnerabilities. And authentication is really just one narrow slice of that. So of course you have to take care of the credentials you manage today at absolute, best of breed capability. So my initial quip aside, yes, do better at managing passwords. And make sure, at least with entropy, you're mitigating one vulnerability, which is people walking away with an encrypted database. You still have the other ones to mitigate, and keep working on that. So I just want to reinforce that, of course, you have to do that. It's all about end-to-end risk management. But about when FIDO is future or FIDO is now, the way to think about that is FIDO capabilities are in market now, and early adopters are taking advantage of them. So the first word in FIDO is fast. Think of FIDO as more making authentication easier for people. Oh, and you get much better security along the way. That's how we designed it. We're a board of hundreds of millions of customers, and we want to focus on the usability experience. So you'll see people getting these FIDO experiences while you still have passwords for years and years to come. So you're still going to have that vulnerability on the edge. So having better governance and better information around your assets and your risk management is going to be important. Even for many years to come, you're going to have that edge vulnerability, even though you are able to deploy FIDO for your maybe power users that have the new Android or iPhones or Windows 10 devices.
I think we're all actually all on the same page, actually. We did when we pre-spoke. I mean, there is some in contention, disagreement potentially around how important passwords are today. But I think the three of us stand here as application tier people. What we're really saying is managing authentication and authorization into the application is the new frontier. I think as an industry, we're rapidly moving away from a perimeter network-centric approach to security and moving quite rapidly towards a user-centric approach to security. And that fundamentally means understanding who does have access to what. I mean, that's the first thing. Today, right now, in your organization, who has access? Critical question, very few people can answer it. The second one is who should have access? I mean, is it appropriate for me to have access to something? That is a much more complex problem. It involves understanding process and policy and job responsibility. So who should have access is very important. And then the who did have access, who gave it to them, when did they have it, and how was it used? And so these are sort of underlying principles of which I agree completely. If we don't have strong authentication, trustworthy authentication, you lose everything below. It's a kind of a necessary but insufficient, I think was the term that was used earlier, that I think is very, very appropriate.
So let me plan that a little bit. So, I think we're all advocates for strong authentication. Before OPM, the two most damaging breaches that the US government had seen were the Bradley or Chelsea Manning WikiLeaks leak, and then somebody named Edward Snowden, both of whom had trusted, I think, strong credentials that were being used in both organizations. How do you guard against insider threat, and how does that fit into an identity-centric approach to security?
I'll take that first. Personally, I think it comes down to behavior. Ultimately, sometime in the future, we are going to have to understand the appropriate behavior and the appropriate use of entitlement. As I said, we have to know who has access to a particular entitlement. We have to understand what it means to have that entitlement. And then we have to be able to define quite clinically when and how it should be appropriately used. And that means a lot more cataloging, a lot more inventory, and a lot more basic management of assets, basically. And so I think that's really understanding of behavior. And I think in order to do that, you really have to more critically understand an entitlement. You have to understand what it means to have a group, for example, and what it means to give that access, and to say, you should never use it. Darren never uses this entitlement from Washington, D.C. He never has done before. He's never used it at midnight from China. He's never used a transaction over $200,000. That's the level. It's like we're moving our security philosophy from the edge and from the network right up to the transaction. Almost. I mean, it's almost transactional to sort of say appropriate use, because our insiders ultimately they don't wear hoodies, right? They don't wear hoodies and jeans and stare at us from across the matrix like that picture we've all seen. They're authenticated, authorized, trusted individuals that invariably behave inappropriately. Whether it's them or someone that's hijacked their account, it's almost irrelevant. We still have to be able to identify that and create an alert. So I think the insider is particularly important, but in order to get there, it comes back down to that inventory thought, and understanding the relationships and being able to catalog it.
Yeah, there's also just some basic blocking and tackling we need to do better on. Unfortunately, fortunately, post those two significant breaches, there was a significant focus on access governance and insider threat and proper authorization. And unfortunately, due to some of the things happening now with IRS and OPM, we've kind of taken a step or two back and reinvigorated the conversation around strong auth and PIV and not looked at everything else in a continuum. And I hope that's just temporary because it is kind of ridiculous that we haven't got PIV implemented here. But I think if anybody did a scan of their user base, they would find excessive entitlements. They would find the person that's been with an agency for 30 years has got the same access they had 30 years ago, whether they needed it or not. There's some basic definitions that need to occur. There's some basic risk management that needs to occur looking at too much entitlement. And we've got to do an unpopular thing, which is deprovision access that you've had for too long. I like the organization that says we're deprovisioning it and taking it away, let them scream. Because the screaming and yelling for that access is not the same as a breach.
Least privilege, right?
Right.
And this term, least privilege.
So there's the old line which says on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. But in the cloud, particularly in the enterprise cloud, it seems like you really need to know who's a dog and who's not. Every person and device is getting through the door with identity. What sort of impact are each of you seeing the rapid move to the cloud and the enterprise have on the importance of identity as a facet of security?
Well, just a quick thing from my perspective. When Google rolled out FIDO U2F support for Google for Work accounts, and they created this, dashboard tools and everything for managing security key credentials for over 5 million businesses that use Google for Work. They were able to do that very quickly. It was something like 4 months between when they rolled it out for their consumers and when they rolled it out for business. So one of the side effects you get by moving to cloud is very fast innovation. When you do have a new, better idea, you can roll it out very quickly and use just web interface for administration, and you're in business. That's one thing I would volunteer.
Well, I think we see from our side, we have a lot of enterprise customers that particularly here in North America, that are moving towards cloud. I think one of the things I find most interesting is people seem to think that it somehow changes something, as if it's different because it's not running on your infrastructure. And I think as soon as you take that kind of governance-based approach to it, I really don't care where the application's running, to be honest with you. It's more or less safe, and there's a set of risk metrics, and there's a set of access evaluation that has to be in place. But it's just another app. Whether we trust the infrastructure that app runs on or not is another question. But we have to manage those applications, and whether they are username, password based or not, there's still accounts. Even if you single sign on, we can use SAML technology until the cows come home. We will still have accounts. In Salesforce.com, I have an account that gives me access to a set of things. Is that appropriate? Am I managing it? And to Paul's point, do I understand the life cycle, the joiner, mover, leaver cycle? And so we really just have to manage. So it's a kind of a zero-sum change, really. It should be. We should be managing those apps. There's a very damaging element to it in that many groups that we see, it happens departmentally. The acquisition of the technology happens outside of a corporate governance or control life cycle. And that, of course, means it's isolated. So I think if it's managed in context with all other apps, which your identity infrastructure should do, then it should be a zero-sum change.
I'm so glad you said that, because I was debating whether to say, why are we treating the cloud as something different? It's not. It's an app. It's a networked app, no different than your Active Directory. There's certainly some nuances there, and of course, when you get into multi-tenant and do you want somebody that's not part of your enterprise actually plugging in the wires and turning the screws? That's something else. But It's just an app. And before I joined NIST, I did a cloud identity strategy for a Fortune 500 company, and their biggest pain point was we put proprietary information in the cloud and we share it with our partners. And when that person leaves the partner organization, they still have access. Well, what do you do? How are you giving access? Well, we're giving them usernames and passwords, and we don't know when they leave that organization. Federate. Simple. Federate. And when they leave that organization, they no longer have access, even if the account is still there.
So let me also shift the conversation a little bit to the role of identity in another segment, not identity of people, but of things. There's a lot of thing systems suddenly getting a lot of attention, and if I can be a dog on the internet, can I be a toaster on the internet? Can I be a car on the internet? Can I be a refrigerator? Are some of the same types of attacks that we're seeing focused on people-centric systems and identity also things that we think we're going to be seeing the next few years in IoT? And are some of the same solutions we're talking about, do they offer any potential to help us protect against those?
I think it's early days to answer that question, to be honest. I guess that's the good news. That the one thing we know is that Internet of Things will not foster until there are standards. So as you see standards efforts stand up, that's really where these questions are going to be answered. Like, what are the standards going to be? How is authentication going to work? How's authorization going to work between devices in the cloud? We are a little bit in the Betamax VHS phase with Internet of Things. They're kind of competing families of industry standards right now. So it's very much early days. But from our perspective, we are looking at Internet of Things use cases in the FIDO Alliance. And what we're presuming is that there will always be a management interface for your connected world. And the devices that can give you a managed interface, that actually give you a UI, those devices are what should be doing user verification and authenticating the user. From then, it's device to device. We have something called the External Authentication Protocol in FIDO to enable device-to-device authentication. And we do think that's going to play a role in Internet of Things. So much more narrow. These Internet of Things devices have far less storage capability, far less compute capability, far less memory, operate with less power. So you can't assume they're all the equivalent of a smartphone. They're not. They're going to be very dumb devices for a long time. And so that's where the technology design is going, is what does it actually have to do? And so getting that minimization just right, so that if we do get it right, that they won't be as vulnerable. The smarter the device, the more vulnerable that device is. The more it can do, then the more it can trick someone into making a bad decision. So I think the vulnerability around Internet of Things is going to live mostly with those devices we use to manage the other devices, as opposed to direct hacks against the edge devices.
Yeah, I don't want to be overly generalistic, but in every IoT thing that I interact with, it's either a 0000 to get to the Bluetooth interface, or it's unauthenticated Wi-Fi. So we're making the same mistakes. Root is now no username in 0000 on IoT. So it is early days, but that gives me pause. I'll paraphrase. I think Ron Ross has said we're doomed. We're not going to be able to secure them.
Okay.
But I and the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, NSTIC, the office that I'm in. I'm really up here because Jeremy still thinks he's my boss. We're proud that we actually just funded our first IoT pilot, which is really looking at not only a convergence of human identity, but that human identity tied to an IoT and that IoT tied to some other IoT in a strong, authenticated manner. We're starting now to tackle that problem. Internet of Things is in our scope, and we're really excited about the opportunities that we can have to impact that area.
I think in the consumer space, it's quite an alarming thing that we're seeing. You can now get a fork, right? It's an internet thing. The fork actually understands who you are. You thumbprint onto it. The fork, believe it or not, the fork knows the time of day that you're eating. It uploads it. It has a website that says when you've been using the fork. These things are troubling.
When you're not using it, is it just limpy, unusable?
Who knows? It's a Kickstarter project basically, but it's it's a net connected fork. Oh my goodness. So I think that in the consumer space, there's considerable concern. I think in the enterprise and the government space, I don't think that fork is going to be being given, PIV credentials and being asked to do work, right? So I don't know as it's quite as alarming a situation for us inside traditional enterprise computing, as it were, wherever you've got enterprise organizational computing. I do think it's important that we don't confuse the Internet of Things with the identity of things. There are some identity management systems that try and blur the line between, they say, oh, just stack all those identities of those things in it's just IAM, right? And it's not. I don't believe myself it is. And I think to pick up on the point that management platforms will exist. If you're in a manufacturing environment where you have autonomous identities in factory equipment, there's a management platform being developed by Bosch or by somebody else that manages those. You're not going to plug each of the pieces of the infrastructure into you're going to want to issue credentials to that management platform. And this is very much like what we've seen with our mobile device management systems. When mobile devices entered into the enterprise, first thing we thought was, shall we bring them into the identity systems? Or we said no. AirWatch, MDM, Mobile Iron, that tool set emerged and created a layer for managing the issuance and the identity of the device. And then we integrated that layer with our identity and entitlement management systems. So I think that's how it's going to go myself.
I would say, though, we can't assume that the consumer threat will not be present in the enterprise. Agreeing with Brett that you got to look at the threats and vulnerabilities. What if I brought that fork to work and that fork had a bad guy riding along with it, and that fork was configured on my BYOT phone, which is now connected to my enterprise network? I'm making it up and I'm being alarmist, but I think we have to look at the unintended consequences and have a risk management plan that is rich enough to catch that.
I think that's absolutely key. And I think one of the most insightful things that I've heard this year was from a shall remain nameless company's security architect who basically said, fundamentally assume compromise. Always assume compromise. Assume that the guy's going to walk in with his fork. Assume that you don't have network access control in place and he's going to connect to your network. Assume that the BIOS has a vulnerability running on it. Assume it's going to be moving around your network, and you better have network security monitoring. You better understand that nothing's ever come from here and gone to there before. Fundamental security principles, which are in Einstein and are in CDM as well. I think it's assume the worst is probably appropriate.
So we got about 5 minutes left. I've got more questions, but let me turn to the audience at this point. Sir. Microphone's coming right behind you.
I didn't hear any of you mention keyloggers, but based on the fact that it's such an extremely easy way to get people's passwords, why do you think we don't see more of those virtual keyboards that have the randomized keys that you need to click on to enter your password? Wouldn't that help a lot in preventing keyloggers?
So I was including that when I said malware, because it's just another form of malware. And I'd say the reason is it's why FIDO has traction. The security model is not why FIDO has traction. The usability model is why FIDO has traction. So if you're going to have those virtualized keyboards that kind of pop up and do different things, and they're at different parts of the screen at different times, because when they know where the keyboard is going to be, they can just come up with a malware kit for that. It's because that's a tough user experience. So overseas, you see it more often. There's a different relationship, especially between banks and users, like in Europe, where usability isn't so important and they don't mind the friction as much, it seems, based on the solutions that work in that market. But with my consumer financial services background, I'd say one of the big reasons is it can still be owned. You can still come up with a new kit to attack that. And secondly, users will hate it. So, you will not see consumer services rolling out security solutions that users don't like, at least not for long.
Any other questions?
Hi, thank you. My name is Mark Anthony Signorino. I'm with the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group here in Washington, D.C. Our organization is a public-private partnership to help operationalize the national strategies for trusted identities in cyberspace. This is an incredibly important issue, I think, for everybody. I mean, what FIDO Alliance is doing is fabulous. You benefit, an organization such as yours, you benefit the entire identity ecosystem by having such leaders like Google, PayPal, Microsoft, all those guys working on this in order to foster good cyber hygiene. And we all know that good cyber hygiene is its own reward. But it's easy to do so when you're sitting on a market cap of $6 billion. What can we do to promote better cyber hygiene in these efforts to push it down into companies that don't have, that have millions in market cap as opposed to billions, where it's a little bit more expensive? I mean, we've seen through, giant breaches, Target, Home Depot, OPM, IRS, and even worse, Ashley Madison. I mean, if nothing freaked people out, it was the Ashley Madison one, because now it's getting hitting real hard close to home. But things aren't changing. So how can we change that, either through policy, best practices? What do you recommend?
So I think when you talk about, it's good to always ask about the small, medium business, right? It's like, are you building a solution that only works for big iron, only works for federal government, only works for e-commerce companies? So what we're doing in FIDO isn't one of those things. It isn't one of those things that comes with a big price tag, because it's just going to be available in open source, something you can put into your web server, or maybe it is an appliance for a while if you want that enterprise level support, but it's not an appliance that's especially expensive for you. So standards and open source, open technology, that's how you get it through the long tail. But I think what you're touching on that has been a barrier for small and medium business is complex risk-based authentication and the kind of systems that we would have to build for ourselves and the major banks build for themselves. When I was at PayPal, that takes a lot of engineering effort, and usually it's more siloed. So there, again, you turn to the vendor space and letting people outsource that kind of intelligence service for themselves. The companies like SailPoint, RSA, and other folks that are in that marketplace, and hopefully they've got cost-appropriate solutions for the small and medium business. But I think it goes beyond best practices and standards when it comes to that real end-to-end management. That's going to be a tool, that's going to be a capability you're actually going to have to put into your infrastructure.
I've got a really cheap one, a really easy one. It's called education. I think somebody said it on one of the last panels. Just educate people. I mean, the trouble is, I feel myself, my job is to make the security that we implement as easy as possible to consume. I almost wish it wasn't, because why should security be free? This is one of our problems. We've all said it should go away, it should be invisible. Maybe it just shouldn't. Maybe it's that important that it needs to be in front of your face every single day, right? Being educated to that, because this problem isn't going away. Somebody said earlier, we're chasing the bad guys and we're 10 steps behind, and that is not going to change. So maybe security, the way we think about it, education and awareness is probably the cheapest thing.
So we've got,
No, go ahead.
we're now in the red. One quick question, lightning round. Focusing on educating folks in this room as consumers, as individuals who are trying to manage this problem in their lives. What's the one piece of guidance you would give them in terms of what they should do to better protect themselves?
Start at the other end.
Well, I'll go. Obviously, the simple thing is to turn on two-factor wherever you can. That does come with its own set of problems that I don't have enough time to talk about. I think it really does get to identity federation, what the NSTIC embodies as valuable, the ability to use the credential of your choice everywhere. I personally want to use this everywhere, but I can't. And that would really, really, really move the needle. But we do need, we need to talk to users, and we really need to talk to the entities out there that aren't in the identity and security business. Why is Amazon not doing two-factor?
It's available. not mandatory.
And even the gaming apps I have. There's a whole host of relying parties that don't know they're relying parties to us identity geeks that we haven't talked to, and I do think we need to target them.
So in addition to two-factor, this might sound like it's coming out of nowhere, but it was a previous standard that I did, and I'm still shocked on how little adoption it has across .gov and .mil. DMARC, protect your email channel. Stop the absolute blatant copying of your domain names, attacking your employees that's happening today with a free and easy standard that you can just turn on, and your InfoSec teams will know how to do that. I would say deploy DMARC and at least narrow the phishing to people having to come up with pretend names in the email address field instead of actually using irs.gov or anything else.
I guess I would say move towards the future, but don't forget where we are today. Most vulnerability is still going to be here. That RecF system that you have, it's been here since I started doing this, right? It's not going away quickly. And so focus on what we have today as well as focusing on the future. So the easy stuff that's there, there's technology available to manage that today, and that's what we should be doing.
All right, thanks. Well, Brett, Paul, Darren, all of you, thanks so much for a great panel.